Đắng thật, cà phê thật. Không ai Việt hơn người Việt. Mạnh chưa đủ, phải đúng gu. G7 2 trong 1, cà phê đích thực của người Việt.
Now, what you just saw was an advertisement for Vietnamese instant coffee. Coffee is pretty much ubiquitous in the modern world as people from every country in the world drink it, but it carries a pretty special significance in Vietnam because Vietnam is actually the second largest coffee producer in the world. That's what we're going to be talking about today in this podcast, but not just coffee in Vietnam, also about the very special relationship and the socialist fraternity between East Germany and Vietnam during the Cold War that kind of helped to develop this relationship founded on the basis of coffee. Now, before we kind of get into the project, I did want to talk a little bit about why I undertook this. So I grew up in an Italian household where coffee is pretty important to us. Every day, my dad would drink like 5 cups of espresso at a time. And knowing and finding out that Vietnam had such an important role on the global stage as a coffee producer really inspired me to look into that history, which turned out to be really interesting. And in addition to that, my dad actually came home one day with a gift from one of his students, which, as you can see, is this actual weasel coffee from Vietnam. And basically what they do to get this coffee is they take civets, which is a type of black weasel, and they feed the coffee beans to them, either in the wild or farmed, and the poop serves to process the beans in a sort of organic way and apparently makes it taste better. But we have yet to try it, so we'll find out soon enough. But yeah. So let's talk about the history of coffee just a little bit. Now, coffee was originally cultivated in East Africa, Ethiopia, Eritrea, and the southern Gulf of Arabia. And it wasn't until the 1600s, the Age of Enlightenment and the age of colonialism, that coffee began to make its way into European markets. It took off really fast in the sort of trendy European coffee houses that started to spring up, especially in Germany, Italy, and France. And pretty quickly, these colonial powers like Spain, France, and even England, although they did prefer tea, they started to look for new markets to grow coffee that were outside of the control of the Muslim world. So initially, coffee was actually introduced to Vietnam in the 1850s by French missionaries who were looking for more cultivatable land. The initial crops were not really on a big scale, though, because they were all grown just by these small missionary plantations. And there were also Arabica beans, which had a lot of trouble growing in the Vietnamese jungles. Robusta beans would prove to be a lot more successful in the future. We know that there was coffee grown in Vietnam all the way into the Vietnam War and in the interwar period too, but frankly, the amount that was growing was likely pretty low. We know that during the Vietnam War, only about 148 acres of coffee remained in all of Vietnam, just due to the intense bombing campaigns done by the United States during the war. It would really only be after the Vietnam War ended that coffee would take off as an industry in the country. So what's the situation of Vietnam after the Vietnam War? Well, basically you have this country that's newly free under a socialist government. They've had a lot of trade in the past with Eastern Bloc countries, especially for raw exports from Vietnam in return for vehicles and especially farming equipment from Eastern Bloc countries like Bulgaria and East Germany. But there's not much industry or agriculture left just because of how damaged the country's been. At the same time, in 1975, there's a terrible, terrible harvest in Brazil, which leads to quadrupling of coffee prices over the next couple of years. Now, if we go over to East Germany, they're having some of their own issues. Coffee was, as I said, very ubiquitous even in Germany, and the East German government actually positioned coffee as a sort of consumer good that represented the socialist ideals. As a tool, it could be used to, increase productivity, as a bonding beverage. So the East German government almost based their legitimacy in this time period on the availability of coffee for its citizens. and they already had some trouble procuring it. The value of the German mark, the East German mark, was much, much lower than that of the West German mark, so it was difficult for them to exchange their currency for goods on the international market. Now, what this meant was that in 1975, East Germany experienced a horrendous coffee crisis. Overnight, their supply problems became terrible, and they had to replace some of their cheapest coffee brands on the market with a mixture of half coffee and half chicory and other additives, which was known as Kaffeemix, and frankly, most people in East Germany did not like it. Immediately, mass protests, letter campaigns, and boycotts of the new product ensued. So the GDR was facing a lot of trouble, and they had to turn somewhere else for their coffee. So, who do they turn to? Vietnam, of course. Now, Vietnam was ripe for these deals. As I said, they were having some serious trouble coming out of their own war with the United States and then China, and they had the prime land to grow coffee, in the Vietnamese highlands especially, and they were realizing pretty quickly that Robusta beans had the potential to grow. So, what do? They strike up some trade deals. The East Germans approached Vietnam in 1977, which is when the floor first opened for their trade deals. And, they needed to provide quite a lot of infrastructure to grow these beans. A lot of this was actually based, too, on the sentiment of kind of mutual assistance. So the idea that East Germany would have to build up the industry in Vietnam was not very far out there. Christina Schwenkel is one of the premier experts on this subject, and she describes it as an effective solidarity. In essence, the trade agreements between socialist nations like Vietnam and East Germany carried a very strong air of mutual assistance to them, as opposed to this idea of foreign aid. So although these trade deals were very similar to what we would see in any kind of capitalist nation, the way they were presented by both governments tended to position the two countries as more equals in creating this mutually beneficial situation. National reconstruction was also a pretty key theme. Basically, the idea was now we need to help out Vietnam with reconstructing their country after they've, driven out imperialism, etc. And it ultimately worked pretty well. By 1980, the GDR had arrived at the conclusion that they would be providing 45 million marks in credit from 1981 to 1985 to develop 10,000 hectares of coffee crop, which was going to be slowly paid off after 1986. There were, of course, some issues. The first issue being that coffee takes 10 years from planting to cultivation. So this was very much a long-term payout for the East Germans. But for Vietnam, they started to experience some pretty immediate benefits. That said, they did need to change some things. So they actually had to redistribute quite a lot of the Viet population to cultivate. Most of the beans were being grown in the Dak Lak province, which was sparsely populated. But over the course of a couple of years, between 75 and 89, the indigenous majority population that was in the region fell from 59% to 29% of the population because they were putting so many people from the north and the south into Dak Lak. Now, these trade deals, these agreements, were pretty complicated in their execution. With this typical East German precision, each aspect of the coffee bean quality was described in these agreements, so they had to be kind of pure, tangy, and strong to make sure that the quality of the beans reached a minimum threshold, which was sort of to ensure that, firstly, the quality would be good enough, but also that the people that were being appeased with these beans in East Germany were getting something that they could tie to the regime and associate with the regime so that, the regime could be seen in a much more positive light. They also had 8 different branches of the GDR's apparatus who were working to provide the specialists in training for Vietnam for the growing process and for other elements of their industry and agriculture, which, the idea was to build them up as fast as possible, to get these beans as fast as possible, but also to develop them as a socialist nation, which, would hopefully provide mutual assistance between the two sides. Now, all the way up until the end, Vietnam and East Germany were working very closely on these trade deals. The GDR, in fact, did not see the collapse of the Berlin Wall happening at all. It came very unexpectedly. Although there had been a lot of inklings of disturbance with Gorbachev, the actual wall itself coming down was a shock to many people. And as a result, Vietnam was suddenly left without a major trading partner when it came to their coffee crop. What this meant was Vietnam was a free agent, actually. So in some ways, it was seen to be a positive thing. Additionally, world coffee prices around 1994 to 1998 were still very high because Brazil had another poor harvest, which meant that the prospect of expanding these nascent coffee farms was very attractive to Vietnam. So the period actually between 1994 and 1998 saw 20 to 30,000 more hectares of coffee plantations planted, which meant that in the early 2000s, there was going to be another explosion in terms of coffee growing. So basically, Vietnam had fallen into this golden situation, even though they had previously a very strong coffee partner. Now they were free in an open market, and what that meant was they could take full advantage of their coffee reserves. A lot of people actually blame this expansion, though, as causing the price depression of coffee beans in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Whether it's solely responsible, though, is maybe unlikely, but a contributing factor potentially. So, where do these post-socialist or post-fall of the Berlin Wall coffee deals place Vietnam in the coffee trade today? Well, in the 1980s, the International Coffee Association was basically the governing body that dictated how coffee trade could occur. Vietnam had never been a member because of their diplomatic isolation up to that point and because they were trading primarily with the Eastern Bloc. Now, a lot of their quotas were wiped away in the late 1980s by the Reagan-era neoliberal kind of free trade policies, which happened to coincide very well with the Vietnamese expansion of the coffee plantations, which catapulted Vietnam to the number 2 producer status for Robusta beans. Number 1 for Robusta beans, number 2 coffee beans overall. So this did open the market to them. It did reduce the price of beans in the 90s and 2000s, but really these Doi Moi reforms and free market reforms in Vietnam were what allowed them to take this position. In the United Nations Socialist Republic of Vietnam Coffee Report from 2004, they were quoted as saying that growth was simultaneously fueled by 2 external factors. Weather problems in Brazil led to the substantial global price hikes in 94 and again in 97, and this coincided with the increased willingness of roasters to utilize more Robusta beans in their blends due to technological processing improvements, which softened the harsher flavor characteristics of this coffee variety, and this considerably increased the demand for Vietnam's coffee and created a unique market opportunity for its Robusta coffees to capture a considerably larger share of the market. So essentially, all of these factors had combined to launch Vietnam into this position. The Dak Lak hinterlands, which is where they grow these Robusta beans, have actually expanded from 6,000 hectares of coffee to around 500,000 hectares, which frankly is an incredible feat. And it actually means that Vietnam's second largest export commodity is their coffee, right after rice. It can really be said that this history of coffee within Vietnam represents not only their sort of expansion of consumer exports in the wake of a kind of liberalizing socialism when it comes to export and trade, but it also sort of demonstrates the ways that the effective solidarities between these socialist countries, like East Germany and Vietnam, can have lasting impacts beyond the Cold War. And in a way, these developments between them and the ways that East Germany helped to develop Vietnam so that Vietnam could hopefully help to develop them and give them the coffee they needed, it really ended up impacting Vietnam much deeper than anyone could have expected, and sort of gave Vietnam a place in the global economy that they wouldn't have had otherwise. So yeah, to me that's pretty fascinating, and I hope you enjoyed listening to it, or listening to me talk about it, as much as I enjoyed doing the research and work for this project.